I was 24 years old when this happened, and at the time, I thought I had the safest job in the world. I worked as a fire lookout for the U.S. Forest Service, stationed alone on top of a mountain in a national forest. My days were quiet. I scanned the tree line for smoke, logged weather changes, and radioed in reports. Most of the time, nothing happened at all. That night started like every other night. It was late summer, and the sun was going down slowly behind the hills. The sky was clear.
No storms.
No wind. The forest below looked calm and empty, stretching out in every direction. I made myself a simple dinner and wrote a few notes in my logbook. I remember thinking how peaceful everything felt. Being alone didn't bother me anymore. I had been up there for weeks. Around dusk, I did my final radio check with dispatch. They confirmed my report and signed off. After that, the radio stayed quiet, just a low static sound in the background. I locked the trapdoor like I always did and walked around the tower, checking the windows. Everything was normal. I sat down in the small chair by the window and watched the light fade. That's when I noticed something that didn't make sense. At first, it was just a sound, very faint, almost easy to ignore. It came from below the tower, somewhere near the base of the stairs. It sounded like wood shifting, the way it does when it cools at night. I told myself that's all it was. The tower made noise all the time. But then I heard it again. This time, it was heavier, more deliberate, like a footstep. I stood up and listened. The forest was completely quiet. No wind. No animals. Just silence. After a few seconds, the sound stopped. I waited, feeling a little uneasy, but not scared. People sometimes wandered off trails during the day. Maybe someone was hiking late. Still, something felt off. No one was supposed to be anywhere near the tower after sunset. The access trail was closed, and the climb up the mountain took hours. Anyone who made it up there would have planned it. I walked to the window and looked down toward the stairs. The light was almost gone, and the trees were already turning black with shadow. I couldn't see anyone, but I had a strange feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. Then I heard breathing. It was quiet and slow, coming from directly beneath me. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stood there listening as the realization settled in that someone else was at my tower, and they hadn't said a word. The fire lookout tower sat on the highest ridge in the forest, a narrow metal structure bolted into rock and surrounded by nothing but trees. From the top, I could see miles in every direction. During the day, the view was beautiful. At night, it felt endless and empty. The nearest town was over an hour away by truck, and the closest ranger station was even farther. Once the sun went down, I was completely on my own. I had taken the job because I wanted something quiet. I was between college semesters and needed work, and the Forest Service position paid well for the season. They warned me ahead of time that I would be alone most nights. I didn't mind. I liked routine. Every morning, I checked the weather instruments, scanned for smoke, and filed reports. In the evenings, I cooked, read, and tried to sleep early. That night was no different. It was just after 8 p.m., and darkness was settling in slowly. The air was warm but cooling fast, and the smell of pine hung in the tower. I had already finished my final sweep with the binoculars and confirmed there were no fires in sight. The radio check with dispatch had gone through without any problems. They wished me a quiet night, the same way they always did. I locked the trapdoor leading up the stairs, not because I was worried, but because it was standard procedure. Hikers weren't allowed up after sunset, and the lock was mostly there to keep animals out. I pulled the curtains halfway closed to block the glare from inside the tower and turned on the small overhead light. Inside, the tower was cramped but organized. A narrow bed against one wall. A small table with my logbook and radio. A stove no bigger than a microwave. Everything had its place. I liked that. It made the space feel controlled, predictable. I was alone, but I didn't feel lonely. I heated up some canned food and ate while listening to the radio chatter fade into static. Outside, the forest grew darker by the minute. The last of the birds went quiet. There was no moon that night, which made the windows feel like black mirrors once the light inside was on. The only other person connected to my shift was the dispatcher on the radio. I had never met her in person. We spoke a few times a day, always about work. Other than that, I had no visitors and no reason to expect any. By the time I finished cleaning up, it was fully dark. The tower creaked softly as the temperature dropped, the metal adjusting to the cold. It was a normal sound, one I had already gotten used to. Nothing about that evening felt dangerous. At least, not yet. After I finished eating, I washed the dishes and set them on the rack by the sink. The routine helped pass the time. I checked my watch and noted the hour in my logbook. Everything was normal.
No smoke.
No weather changes. Just another quiet night on the mountain. I sat down on the edge of the bed and listened to the forest. That's when I noticed how quiet it really was. Usually there were sounds at night. Insects. Wind in the trees. The occasional animal moving through the brush. That night, there was nothing. The silence felt heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. I told myself it was just the calm before the temperature dropped further. A few minutes later, the tower made a soft creaking noise. I froze for a second, then relaxed. The structure always made noise as it cooled. I had learned to ignore it. Still, this creak sounded different. Lower, slower, like pressure instead of shifting metal. I stood up and walked to the window. I pressed my face close to the glass and looked down toward the base of the tower. The stairs disappeared into darkness after the first few steps. I couldn't see the ground, but I waited anyway, scanning for movement. Nothing moved. The forest looked the same as it always did at night. I stepped back and turned away from the window. That's when I heard it. A dull thump from below. It wasn't loud. It wasn't sudden. It sounded like something brushing against the stairs or the support beams. I held my breath and listened. The sound didn't repeat itself right away. I told myself it could have been an animal. A deer or a bear sometimes wandered close, even if it was rare. But animals didn't usually stop and stay still. I moved slowly across the room, making sure not to make any noise of my own. The floor was cold under my feet. I reached for the radio, but didn't turn it on. I didn't want to announce that I was awake. Another sound came up through the tower. This one was clearer. A footstep. It came from the stairs below, spaced and careful, as if whoever was making it was testing each step. Though it didn't creak the way it usually did under my weight. It was lighter, controlled. My stomach tightened. I stayed where I was, counting the seconds. The step didn't repeat. I wondered if I had imagined it. Stress played tricks on you when you were alone too long.
I had heard other lookouts talk about that.
Then I heard breathing. It was faint, almost lost in the silence, but it was steady. Slow inhales, slow exhales, coming from directly beneath the trapdoor. I felt a cold wave move through my chest. Someone was there. And whoever it was, they weren't trying to make themselves known. I didn't move after I heard the breathing. I stood in the middle of the tower, listening, afraid that even the smallest sound would give me away. My heart was beating hard, but I forced myself to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help me think. The breathing stopped. For a few seconds, there was nothing at all. No steps. No movement. Just silence again. That almost made it worse. Whoever was down there knew I had gone quiet. It felt like they were listening the same way I was. Then the stairs creaked. One step. Then another. Slow. Controlled. Someone was climbing up. I backed away until my shoulders touched the wall. The tower suddenly felt too small. There was only one door, one way in or out, and it was directly above the stairs. I realized how trapped I really was. There was nowhere to run. The windows didn't open wide enough for me to escape, and even if they did, the drop was deadly. I reached for the radio with shaking hands and lifted it from the table. I turned the volume knob slightly, just enough to hear the static. I whispered the dispatcher's call sign, hoping the signal would carry. No response. The radio crackled and went quiet again. Another step. The footsteps were closer now. I could hear the weight shift with each movement. This wasn't an animal. No animal climbed stairs like that. Whoever it was had done this before, or at least knew exactly what they were doing. The trapdoor latch rattled. I felt my chest tighten as I watched the handle move slightly, just a test. They were checking if it was locked. I had locked it out of habit earlier. That simple routine was the only thing between me and whoever was below. I held the radio to my mouth and tried again, speaking a little louder this time. My voice sounded calm, but my hands were shaking so badly I had to steady them against the table. Nothing. The latch rattled again, harder now. The metal tapped softly against the frame. The person on the other side knew the door was locked. They didn't leave. They stayed there right under my feet. I could hear them breathing again, closer than before. Then something scraped against the trapdoor. A long, dragging sound, like metal or hard plastic being pulled across wood. I had no idea what they were using, but the sound told me they were trying to force it open. I backed farther into the corner, my eyes fixed on the door. Whatever was down there wasn't lost. They weren't confused. They were trying to get inside. The scraping under the trapdoor grew louder. It wasn't random anymore. Whatever the man was using, he was pressing it into the seam, trying to pry it open. The whole door vibrated slightly with each attempt. I could hear his breathing clearly now, rougher than before, like he was putting effort into it. I realized then that staying silent wasn't helping me. I grabbed the radio and turned the volume all the way up. The sudden burst of static filled the tower. I spoke loudly and clearly, forcing my voice to stay steady as I called dispatch again. I gave my tower number and said someone was trying to break in. I repeated it twice. The scraping stopped. For a moment, I thought it had worked. I stood there holding the radio, listening. My heart was pounding so hard it made my ears ring. I waited for footsteps going back down the stairs. Instead, the trapdoor shook violently. The man slammed his shoulder into it.
Once. Twice.
The hinges groaned. Dust fell from the ceiling onto the floor. I stumbled back and nearly lost my footing. The lock held, but just barely. I looked around the tower for anything I could use. There wasn't much. I grabbed the emergency flare from the wall and held it in both hands. It wasn't a weapon, but it was all I had. If he got through the door, I planned to use it. The banging continued. Harder now. Faster. The man wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. I backed into the far corner and crouched down, keeping my eyes on the door. My legs felt weak, like they might give out. I could smell sweat and metal through the cracks in the wood. The tower felt like it was shaking with every hit. Then, suddenly, everything stopped.
No banging. No scrapping. No breathing.
The silence was overwhelming. I stayed where I was, afraid to move. Seconds passed. Then minutes. I didn't know if he had given up or if he was waiting for me to make a mistake. I slowly crawled back to the radio and called for help again. This time, a voice came through. Dispatch answered. I spoke quickly, telling them exactly what was happening. They told me to stay locked inside and that rangers were on the way. As if he heard that, the footsteps started again. But this time they were moving away. I listened as the man went down the stairs, one step at a time. I waited until I couldn't hear him anymore. Even then, I didn't move. I stayed on the floor, holding the flare, until the flashing lights of the ranger trucks finally cut through the darkness hours later. I didn't sleep that night. The rangers arrived just after midnight. 2 trucks came up the service road with their lights off until the last stretch. When I saw the beams sweep across the trees below the tower, my knees finally gave out. I unlocked the trapdoor only after they called up to me and identified themselves. They searched the area immediately. I stayed inside while they moved through the forest with flashlights and radios. From above, I could see the lights spreading out, slow and methodical. They checked the stairs, the base of the tower, and the surrounding tree line. After about 30 minutes, one of the rangers climbed up to speak with me. He told me they hadn't found anyone. What they did find was worse. At the base of the stairs, hidden behind one of the support beams, they found a backpack. It was old and dirty, like it had been sitting there for a while. Inside were protein bars, bottled water, spare clothes, and a roll of duct tape. There was also a hunting knife wrapped in a cloth, the blade sharpened recently. The ranger asked me how long I had been at the tower. When I told him it had been almost 2 months, his expression changed. He explained that the ground around the tower showed multiple sets of footprints. Some were fresh, others were older. Someone had been walking around the tower repeatedly, long before that night. Then he showed me something else. Carved into one of the wooden supports, just out of sight unless you knew where to look, were tally marks.
Dozens of them.
Deep cuts made with a blade. The ranger believed each mark represented a day. That meant whoever the man was, he hadn't just arrived that evening. He had been there for weeks, possibly longer. Watching the tower, learning my routine. They searched farther into the woods and found a shallow campsite less than 100 yards away. A sleeping bag, food wrappers, a spot worn into the dirt where someone had been lying down night after night, facing the tower. The realization hit me all at once. The man hadn't been lost. He hadn't wandered up by accident. He had been waiting. The rangers took photos, collected evidence, and filed a report. They told me there had been no recent missing persons that matched the description, and no reports of anyone living off-grid in that area. By morning, the forest looked normal again. Peaceful, quiet. But I knew something had been very wrong there long before I ever heard the first footstep. I didn't stay in the tower after that night. The Forest Service offered to move me to another location, but I turned it down. I packed my things the next morning while 2 rangers stayed nearby. In daylight, everything looked harmless. The trees were still. The stairs were quiet. The tower stood there like it always had. If I hadn't lived through it, I would have believed nothing had ever happened. Before I left, one of the rangers handed me a copy of the report number and told me they would follow up if they learned anything new. He tried to sound reassuring, but he didn't make any promises. They had no name, no face, and no clear direction of where the man had gone. The case stayed open. Weeks later, I got a call from the ranger station. They told me someone had returned to the tower site after I left. No one had tried to break in. No equipment was damaged. But the lock on the trapdoor had been tested again. Scratches on the metal. Fresh ones. They couldn't tell me when it happened. They also found one new mark carved into the wooden support beam, added below the others. Just one. Deep and clean like the rest. I asked if they thought it was the same person. The ranger paused before answering. He said there was no proof either way. I still think about that pause. I moved back to the city after the season ended. I sleep better with noise around me now. Traffic. Voices. Anything that reminds me I'm not alone. But sometimes late at night, I catch myself listening for footsteps anyway. I wonder how many nights he stood under that tower, looking up, knowing I was there. I wonder what would have happened if the lock had failed. Or if my radio hadn't worked when it finally did. Most of all, I wonder why he left. No one was ever arrested. No suspect was ever identified. And no one could explain why someone would choose to wait that long in the woods, just to get close to a person they had never met. Every fire season, new lookouts take jobs in towers just like mine. They lock the trapdoor. They trust the quiet. And I can't help but think that somewhere out there, someone else is still watching and waiting. I didn't stay in the tower after that night. The Forest Service offered to move me to another location, but I turned it down. I packed my things the next morning while 2 rangers stayed nearby. In daylight, everything looked harmless. The trees were still. The stairs were quiet. The tower stood there like it always had. If I hadn't lived through it, I would have believed nothing had ever happened. Before I left, one of the rangers handed me a copy of the report number and told me they would follow up if they learned anything new. He tried to sound reassuring, but he didn't make any promises. They had no name, no face, and no clear direction of where the man had gone. The case stayed open. Weeks later, I got a call from the ranger station. They told me someone had returned to the tower site after I left. No one had tried to break in. No equipment was damaged. But the lock on the trapdoor had been tested again. Scratches on the metal. Fresh ones. They couldn't tell me when it happened. They also found one new mark carved into the wooden support beam, added below the others.
Just one.
Deep and clean like the rest. It was chilling to see it, even from photos. It was clear someone had returned, after all that time, to leave their mark. I asked if they thought it was the same person. The ranger paused before answering. He said there was no proof either way. I still think about that pause. I moved back to the city after the season ended. I sleep better with noise around me now. Traffic, voices, anything that reminds me I'm not alone. But sometimes late at night, I catch myself listening for footsteps anyway. And then I remember the sound of slow, deliberate breathing under the trapdoor. I wonder how many nights he stood under that tower, looking up, knowing I was there. I wonder what would have happened if the lock had failed. Or if my radio hadn't worked when it finally did. Most of all, I wonder why he left. Every fire season, new lookouts take jobs in towers just like mine. They lock the trapdoor. They trust the quiet. And I can't help but think that somewhere out there, someone else is still watching and waiting. Sometimes, when I drive up the mountain to visit the area for hiking, I pause and glance at the tower. Even from the road, the silhouette of it against the sky seems to stare back. And I feel that same unease I did that night, years ago. The sense that someone or something knows exactly where I am, even when I'm nowhere near the tower. I've tried to tell myself it was a one-time thing, that he was gone. But the scratches, the marks, and the stories from other lookouts suggest otherwise. People disappear. People wander off trails. And some of them never come back. I can't shake the thought that he, or someone like him, might still be up there waiting, watching, planning. And I know that if I ever hear a scrape on metal in the middle of the night, I might not be able to convince myself it's just the wind. The forest is quiet again. Too quiet. And sometimes, in that silence, I swear I hear footsteps on the stairs, even when no one is there. I don't know if he's gone for good. And I don't think I ever will, because some things never leave.